Should Dark Souls have an easy mode? No. No, of course not. No, it shouldn't. Not at all. And Elden Ring's no different either. When you play a game like Halo for the first time, the first thing that happens when you click Start Solo Campaign is you see this. The game asks you what difficulty you want to play on. This happens in so many games that people have just sort of become complacent to it, like it's the new normal. But think about it for a second. Before you've played a single second of gameplay, the game is asking you what difficulty you want. How are you supposed to know which of these difficulties should be best for you? The difficulty settings are so inconsistent between games that they basically mean nothing to a brand new player. Gears of War, for example, has only 3 settings, so which of these is equivalent to Heroic on Halo? I mean, the difficulty settings aren't even consistent between the Halo games, let alone between entirely different franchises. Halo 2 is infamously extraordinarily difficult on Legendary difficulty, much more difficult than Legendary in any of the other games in the series. If Halo can't even get their difficulty settings consistent in their own franchise, how is a new player ever to know what difficulty setting to choose in other games? Compare this to Elden Ring, along with all the rest of the Souls-like genre of games. These games have a difficulty curve that has been expertly crafted around exactly what the player is experiencing, because the devs know what the player is experiencing. Everything down to the precise damage numbers of each of the enemy's attacks is perfectly calculated so that the game feels good. Games like Elden Ring have a high difficulty, but the difficulty curve is well made, starting comparatively slow to what the game becomes later on. But games like Halo, they have difficulty curves that look something like this, where any of these could be what the player wants, but they're not created equal. And there's no way to know before you start playing which of these is actually the one for you. But if the difficulty settings are so bad, why do they exist in the first place? And why do so many countless numbers of games feel the need to give you so many options for you to get confused by? Well, the answer's quite simple. It's accessibility. If your grandma wants to play some Halo, she can. She can play on easy mode, and she might have a blast. But if you're feeling like the biggest gamer in town, you can play on Legendary, and it'll give you the challenge that you need to find the game engaging. Well, at least that's the theory anyway. Because in practice, I think this reasoning doesn't actually make sense. The reasoning to use difficulty settings in games, in my opinion, is entirely bollocks. Because the difficulty settings are only as good as the developer makes them. They're only as useful as the guy who tuned them to the difficulties they're actually meant to represent. Because these examples are just idyllic versions of what a difficulty setting will be. Because the reality is, the lowest difficulty setting might still be too hard for your grandma. Or hey, maybe it's too easy and she should have played on normal and now she gets bored. And the highest one might be too hard for little Timmy who thinks he's the biggest gamer in town. And difficulty settings have to be just right for a player to be as engaged as possible. If you pick normal and you find it too easy, you might just get bored of the game because it isn't challenging you enough. Pick heroic and find it too hard and maybe you'll just quit entirely out of frustration. Halo 3 says that heroic is the way the game is meant to be played, but just saying that doesn't make people actually pick the difficulty. And even then, what does this even mean? There's no meaningful differences to these difficulties anyway. The only difference is the damage and health numbers of yourself and your enemies. So what thought really went into making heroic the way it's meant to be played? Does that mean that they designed the entire game with heroic in mind and the other ones are just slapped there for accessibility's sake? Or does it mean that they designed 4 difficulty settings, played them all, and then decided this one was the real one? Was heroic playtested the most? Are the people that are playing on the other difficulty settings playing less tailored experiences? It's all very up in the air. None of this actually makes much sense. And there's no clarification from the developers anywhere. Elden Ring might just be inaccessible to some players because of how hard the game is. But quite frankly, I think that that's fine. I would personally much rather have a game's difficulty be carefully planned out for the entire game than have 4 half-assed difficulty options thrown at me at the start. Because yeah, maybe there's games out there that are too hard for me to play, but I just won't play them. There's plenty of fish in the sea, and I don't see why the Souls-like genre in particular is expected to cater towards a target audience that the game just wasn't designed to please in the first place. I'd much rather have no difficulty option at all, even if it gates me out of playing the game. Because picking the wrong difficulty for my skill level might just ruin an otherwise great game for me for no good reason. and the same can happen to you. In my opinion, a much better approach to difficulty settings is something like assist mode in Celeste. The game has one difficulty, and the game is entirely tailored for one single experience that has a smooth difficulty curve. But if you find the game too hard but still want to see what happens at the end, there's assist mode. You can make the game slower, you can give yourself extra dashes and infinite stamina, and even make yourself invincible. So if you are struggling with the game, you can tweak the difficulty slightly. The game makes it extremely clear that this is not the way the game is meant to be played, but it's still left open for those who want to use it. And it lets you tailor your experience based on how much trouble you're actually having. You can make it slightly easier by making the game 10% slower, maybe. Or you can make it literally impossible to fail. But it's all up to you, and it's clearly a side option. Now, do I think Elden Ring should have an assist mode? No, obviously not. This sort of solution doesn't work for every game, and again, I don't think Elden Ring should have any difficulty settings at all, because of the style of game that it is, and the audience that it's trying to target. If the developer's vision of the game is crushingly difficult combat, then there's no reason for the developers to add something like this. I personally think that when it comes to difficulty, games being a bit inaccessible is completely fine. But if a developer is worried that their game is going to have accessibility issues based on the difficulty, I would much rather they used this than this. But of course, assist mode is also not a flawless execution either, because it's called assist mode, and it's designed to make the game easier, not harder. So instead of causing issues of choice paralysis at the start of the game, you instead hurt people's pride. A lot of people are too proud to use assist mode to beat a game. They'd rather quit entirely than take the ego hit. Which is another issue that is avoided in Souls-likes by dodging the use of it entirely. When it comes to accessibility, I think that it is entirely unacceptable to prevent access to players based on any sort of disabilities. Colourblindness, hard of hearing, hard of seeing, you name it. But when it comes to difficulty, I think that some games being too difficult for some people is completely fine. Not every type of game appeals to everyone, and the game's difficulty is part of what gives the game the appeal that it already has to the people who already like it. Reducing that difficulty so that it can be more inclusive can sometimes unnecessarily take away the game's identity. So no, I don't think Elden Ring should have an easy mode. As much as it would be great for a game to be more accessible, sometimes accessibility gets in the way of the designer's vision for what they want the game to be. Thanks for watching.